What you don't want to do is buy the wrong gear. It's the costly consequence of too much gas, and that's why I try to be very contextual in my reviews. I may not be the best photographer, but I strive to take a ton of shots, not just ones around the house or the yard, when I'm reviewing. My entire thesis for this channel is to review equipment in the company of everything you already own or plan to own. So that's what we'll do today. I'm just like you. When new products drop on embargo day, I binge all those reviews, and I love doing so. Watching them helps me make these videos better. But it can be hard to differentiate from your favorite YouTuber's excitement and the core of their true recommendations. I'm straddling both the enthusiast and pro world. I'm a stills first shooter, and I've been shooting for about 3.5 years. This is the story of my kit in full, so buckle up. This may run pretty long, and we're just chatting, kind of like a video podcast for this one. This first part is the fun stuff in my kit, lenses and bodies. The second part will be the important stuff, or accessories that aren't as much fun to gas up on. And part 3 will be the bag itself, the f-stop Talopa 50 liter, which I've cross-country road trip tested, who that might be for, and who might regret picking that up. If you don't care about the pre-RF days, you can skip to the next chapter down below. The short version is that I started with an APS-C DSLR and a handful of lenses before I arrived at the RP and built my kit around the RF 24-105 f4. I'm currently shooting with the R6, and the RP is my backup. The good old Rebel T7i. Before this, it was just my iPhone, I think the 6S at the time, and I got this camera before my first trip to Colorado. It was August 2018, and the RP wasn't a thing. And at the time, it probably would have been a bit too expensive for me to jump into photography with that camera. Deep down, I knew that I would love photography, and I probably could have stretched a little bit more because I didn't truly think that I would give up on it, but the price point of the T7i seemed like an ideal compromise between photo and video features, my desire not to start at the extreme entry level, and hedging my bets in case I didn't end up using the camera that much. As I've documented before, I was a little bit hesitant about the 18-55 kit lenses, and I wanted that f1.8 look, and so I started with the 50mm nifty 50. As you might guess, in retrospect, that 80mm full frame equivalent was not the one to bring on a trip where I'd want to be shooting some landscape photography. Despite the ill-fitting focal length for that first trip, the combo was enough for me to fall in love. Not long after, I snagged the EFS 24mm. Now that's not super wide still on the Rebel line, but it's close to get to that 35mm equivalent. That lens made shooting video in tight spaces much more doable, and while I moved both of those first two lenses along, they provided a good foundation when I was learning manual mode in the beginning. Now after those two, I made a mistake, also documented. I got greedy wanting more light and thought the 50mm f1.4 would be fun to trade up for. Contrast and sharpness aren't everything, but I don't think the 1.4 is worth the money. Or at the very least, maybe my expectations were too lofty. I did love rediscovering the 50mm focal length on the full frame when I adapted that to the RP, but the value to cost ratio of the f1.8 is the sweet spot. I've never used the EF 50mm 1.2, but given the modern options, I think the choice is between the 1.8 and the 1.2, and the 1.4 can be excluded. If you can get it used at a great price, that's a little bit different. I later snagged the EFS 17-55 f2.8, and that's sort of like an EFS L lens. The T7i and similar bodies aren't great in low light, and I'm sure if I had that today, I could do a much better job than I was doing when I first started, but spending money on that faster zoom lens helped me tremendously when shooting my first paid gigs. I waited to get this until I was making money with my camera, and that was a good decision. At the time, I was putting 100% of the money I was making from gigs back into gear. In actuality, it was probably more like 150%. At the time, photography and hockey were the two things that I spent the majority of my free time on, and because I was putting in so many hours per week, I wasn't shy about spending money on those things. This brings us to the last piece of legacy gear, and that was the 100mm macro. That lens is no longer with us since I've shot the thumbnail. Always shoot thumbnails first, kids. For me, this purchase defined the moment between, hey, photography is cool, and okay boys, let's go. On the T7i, I used it partially for the macro and partially as a knockoff 70-200. Having a fast, approximately 160mm focal length equivalent was nice to have around. And just like the 50mm that I had, I liked rediscovering the 100 in its true focal length on the RP when I adapted it. In fact, some of my favorite road trip images from earlier in this year I shot on that lens. But now, with the RF 70-200 f4 and the 35mm macro, I used this lens less and less. I've also encountered a few situations where a faster 85 would be preferable. It was my first L, and I'll miss it, but that's what I've done. I've sold the 100mm and swapped it out for the Rokinon 1.4. Oops, that's not the Rokinon. This is actually the Rokinon f1.4, but if you'd like to see more about that lens on January 3rd, maybe go ahead and subscribe. So enter the Canon RF, fast forward to the Canon RP. It's 2020, pandemic times. Shooting solo ended up being a nice pandemic activity. So after pinching pennies at the start of the pandemic, I pulled the trigger and upgraded to this. And the big choice for me at that time was whether to go with the 24-105 STM version or the 24-105 L version. And if you're new, I have a whole video on that comparison, but I went with the 24-105 USM L. I wasn't particularly interested in the Trinity 24-70. I'm not sure why. I just knew there was lots of other things that I would like to get. So I just made a bet at that time that the longer coverage of the 24-105 at that f4 aperture would be a better fit for me long term. So far that has paid off. While I'm a stills first shooter, I don't necessarily have a specialty or niche. Getting this as my first lens and building around it has allowed me to build a kit that's versatile enough to handle many things, as well as cover the range of the EFS 17-55 on my T7i, a combo that I figured I would go on to sell. I like landscape, I like product. 105 at f4 is nice for a portrait, it works for YouTube, and so I think this will continue to be my middle of the kit zoom lens for a while to come. The next two pickups were for fairly specific uses. After I started making more with my photography, making more with some side freelance work, and I had some product photography on the horizon, I picked up the 35mm macro. So if I looked ahead to what my mirrorless kit would include, I'd have the RP, I'd have the 24-105 zoom, I could adapt the 100, and the 35 just kind of made sense as a faster, wider option. To have something like this for YouTube wasn't a priority at the moment, given kind of the number of videos that I had put out, but I do use this for just about every single video now. I don't end up shooting a lot of my personal shots with this lens, and I'm a bit puzzled as to why. I'll try to make it a point in the coming year to constrain myself to just this lens for a trip and go solo so that I can reflect with a deeper review. This second pickup was specifically for dabbling in astrophotography and particularly Milky Way shots. The 35 is actually good for playing around with this, but the 14mm lets you keep the shutter open for a lot longer, and the edges of the frame are a lot cleaner, at least in terms of the quality of the stars. I don't see myself getting a star tracker anytime soon. I don't plan on getting that deep in astrophotography, at least not that quickly. So in the meantime, there's lots to learn about stacking, post-processing, and it's just nice to have a fast ultra-wide hanging around. I took some cool shots on my road trip with this lens too. It's relatively small and light, it's weather sealed. I just updated the firmware to work with the IBIS on the R6. There's a lot to like, but it's not a very versatile lens unless you love being stuck at 14mm. I generally don't. I think that's probably true for most people. So more on that at the end of the video when I start to look forward. Finally, as I tried the career switch and wanted to get into full-time creative work, I picked up the R6 as my main body because I wanted to have two. It was definitely to access some of the better pro features, weather sealing, high stills frame rate, dual card slots, better 4K, but I did want that safety of the RP as my backup body. I considered the R5 briefly, but the cost was a chief consideration. I don't miss 8K video. I do miss the ability to shoot 4K 120. I wouldn't use that all that often, but I do wish I had it. There are a few times when I wish I had more megapixels to use when cropping, but I'm not sure that that benefit outweighs the super manageable raw file size that you get with the R6 when you start shooting at that 12 or 20 frames. I also wanted to skip out on the expensive CF Express cards for the R5 at the time. In short, this is basically the dream stills camera that I've always dreamt of having. And it has tons of video features to grow into if I want to go deeper there. For example, I haven't shot anything in any of the C logs on this camera yet. And skipping on the R5 allowed me to pick up the 70-200 f4 shortly after its release. I've always wanted a 70-200. I was waiting for this to drop, and it's my favorite lens. It's a perfect pairing for the R6 because the IBIS image stabilization combo is great. Right now, if I could only keep one lens for personal photography, it would probably be the R6, this lens, and I would just fancy myself a long lens landscape shooter. There have been one or two instances where I wish I had the f2.8 for light, but not enough to justify or even prompt a yearning for a true switch. None of it was paid gig work anyway, so I just did my best. Further, when I tested both, especially for hiking around, I prefer the F4 form factor. And coming full circle, it's hard to go wrong with the nifty 50. I'm still really trying to figure out which of the prime focal lengths I love, and so having the more affordable versions of all of them allows me to play around before I commit to anything more expensive long term. So in addition to being a super portable option for the RP, this one has some sentimental value as well. So that wraps up what I have. 2 RF bodies, 24 to 200 millimeters, covered by F4 zooms with faster, affordable primes at 14, 35, 50, and 85. I obviously have a bias, but I think this is a really strong kit for someone like me that does some paid shooting, that does YouTube and plans to, and it does a lot of personal shooting without necessarily having a specialty. But this is only the context of now and looking backward. What about the future? I have some loose plans, but because I think I have most of my needs covered, it's more about wants, and for me, consolidation, and how I can best fit everything that I need into my bag. In fact, I'm gonna make a bet that I do have everything that I need for the year of 2022. If I can swap 2 or 3 lenses for one, I may consolidate. I could see consolidating lighting, maybe some of the storage options that I have. Otherwise, I don't plan on buying a new lens or a new body in the coming year. So looking forward, let's start with the swap that I just made. Grabbing the 85 in place of the 100 millimeter lets me keep a longer prime, but improves my low light capability. Plus I can ditch the adapter for a shorter footprint. On the wide end of things, I have a bit more of a mess, and I'm not exactly sure what to do. I could swap the 35mm macro and the Samyang 14 for the Canon RF 14 to 35. This makes the most sense for personal landscape, but it's not the best for YouTube. It's not going to be good for Astro, and I find myself using the 35 f1.8 in the coffee shop for some of the paid work often. So while I'm very excited to try that lens, I'm not super keen on this option. Now I could swap those same 2 lenses for the RF 15 to 35 f2.8. This would be the most versatile pick, and that's definitely the one Trinity lens that I think I would use now and for the foreseeable future. It gets me more excited than that 24 to 70 or obviously the 70 to 200 2.8. The size, weight, and price are all pretty big negatives in that scenario, as I'd have to kick in a lot of extra cash in addition to selling these 2 lenses. I also think I might miss the f1.8, but I think that's a smarter option for me than getting the 14 to 35. The least versatile option in terms of zooming would be to wait to see what Canon does with their flagship 35mm that has yet to be announced. Or 2, if they end up going with the DS version of that, I think I heard early rumors of. I would need to be better sold on using the 35mm as a prime for my personal photography, but having something with a super fast aperture that would be weather sealed and potentially smaller than the 15 to 35 zoom would make me pretty excited. I could always rent a wide fast lens, specifically for trips if I'm going out with the intention of shooting the Milky Way. The 85 f1.4 handles those situations that I've gotten stuck at f4 with the 70 to 200. For sports I go on to shoot, f4 will have to cut it, or I'll rent the f2.8 zoom if it's paid and indoors. For longer than 200, either sports, landscape, wildlife, that's where I'd want to spend the $2,700 for the white, weather sealed, keep it for 5 years, RF 100 to 500. If I had to guess, the long end is probably the last thing that I'll pick up. I haven't shot much past 200, so I need some more time to learn my preferences at that super long range. I'd also want to consolidate beforehand to allow for room, in hopes of maybe fitting that in my bag. I'd also love to get one of the f1.2 flagship primes at one point, and like I said, if and when it comes out, it could be the 35mm. Otherwise, it's likely the 50mm 1.2. If someone makes a weather-sealed 50mm f1.4, relatively small, and it comes in at $999, they're gonna have my money first though. For a long time, I was eyeing up one of Canon's flagship 85mm f1.2 lenses, but like the nifty 50, the Rokinon 85 1.4 is just such a great value compromise. I don't focus on portraiture either at the moment, so unless I start doing that a lot, I don't think the 85 1.2s make a lot of sense for me to own. On the body front, I love having 2 and the peace of mind and having a backup. I also love the RP for a compact option, but if I'm being really, truly honest with myself, having two is partially redundant. Because I do a relatively small amount of on-site paid photography, having the camera fail would be a nightmare, but it wouldn't be the end of the world like it would be if that happened during a wedding and I only had one body. I'm also hesitant to part with this in case my channel grows and I want to set up a secondary angle, use this as a very compact top-down. I've also used this as a webcam quite a lot on my desk. Sometimes at the coffee shop, I stick this on the tripod as a static video shot, and then I shoot stills around whatever we're shooting. That's nice to do as well. So depending on the day, I kind of talk myself in or out of whether or not that RP is truly redundant for me. But it's nice to have. I'm intimidated to make reviews on the bodies because I don't know all the ins and outs of the video modes and some of the finer details around the sensors, but I'll shoot for getting those videos out in 2022. And the R6 is feeling very good after a year. Would the R5 be a slight bump? Probably. Do I dream of the integrated grip of the R3? Sure. But the R6 is extremely capable. Theoretically, maybe I could consolidate both of these bodies into an R5, but again, still up in the air on whether I want to keep two long-term or not. If it were only my personal shooting, I think I identify most as a landscape shooter, but this current kit really sets me up to have a viable solution across many different scenarios. I think given what I do and what a lot of you probably do or hope to do in the near future, I've spent where it matters, and I think I've saved money where I could. If you're new to this channel and somehow you've made it all the way here, my name is Dan. I've reviewed most of this stuff that I've talked about, so watch another one and let me know what you think I could have done differently or might consider in the future down below.